Okay, while we're waiting for that PowerPoint to come up, I'll make a couple of introductory comments to what I'm going to cover. It was interesting going around at the very beginning of the discussion just now. Cast your mind back. We have some people turning up late. Many of you had of not being able to submit your homework. Now, what this indicates is just how busy our lives are. How much we have to balance all these competing interests. And how none of us in this room have really got the time to do everything that we have to do. The issue that you had, wrong email address. How many times have I discovered that with my students? That they're not accessing the university email address and therefore they don't get the messages. The language barriers. Now, you speak with a particular accent, I speak with a particular accent. It takes us a while to get used to being able to really understand what the other person is saying. Now, what all these things point to me is just how complex our role is. So we're talking about the complexity of doctoral supervision, and here we've got a very nice example in this room of just how complex our role is. Our role as supervisors, as academics. Now, I'm a supervisor and I'm an academic, and I have been for 40 years, because I've got a mission. My mission is to make available to everyone who's got the capacity the opportunity to make their fullest contribution that they can to knowledge and to society. Now, that's a mission I had when I was a secondary school teacher 45 years ago. That's a mission which I've still got today. So supervising for me is an opportunity to be able to give that opportunity to others. It also gives me a very good income. A professorial salary in Australia is much higher than it is here. It gives me status, gives me security. So there are those immediate self-interests as well as the broader social interests that come together for why I like to supervise, why I like to work with doctoral students, why I like to work with supervisors. Now, it's got a lot of challenges being a supervisor, and I want to spend just 1 minute to have you jot something down. Just 1 minute. We won't talk about it now, but we'll come back to it later. I want you to think in terms of what you've been saying, even looking at your homework, reading through a dissertation, looking for, well, what might have been missing here? What were the deficiencies? Also think about some of your positive experiences in being a supervisor, in working with a student, or in being supervised, because at one point all of us were being supervised as well. And just spend 1 minute now, you've got little notepads here, to write down two things. I want you to write down what your experience has been for the biggest challenge of supervision. What has been the biggest challenge for you? And also, what has been the biggest incentive, the biggest benefit for you? So one negative, the biggest challenge, what's been the most difficult thing to cope with in supervision, and one positive aspect, what has been the most advantageous? What have you been privileged to experience because of being a supervisor or working with students? So just 1 minute, if you can just jot something down there and we'll come to it later. Now, it's not a test. I'm not going to be testing anyone on this. So the first thing that comes to your mind, you don't have to compare it with what anyone else has written, so you're not going to be judged by what you say. And while you're doing that, for those of you who need a little bit more time, I'll just point out what I'm going to cover in the next few minutes. I want to talk a little bit generally about what it means to supervise PhD research. I want to talk about our responsibilities both to a research outcome, such as a PhD thesis or a publication, but also our responsibilities for the development of the researcher capacity of another person, quite apart from the actual material output. I want to talk about a framework that we use increasingly in Australia, the Researcher Development Framework. I'll touch on the supervisor-student relationship. I'll lay down a little bit of a challenge for us to be honest when we reflect upon our own situation, to be honest in terms of our availability, our attitude and our knowledge as supervisors. I'll touch on understanding student expectations. When we're given a PhD student to supervise, what are they expecting from that relationship? So we need to think and reflect upon expectations, both our expectations of the student and the student's expectations of us, and ensuring that we've got a match between their expectations and our expectations, and how we can establish where there might not be a match between the two sets of expectations. And finally, I just want to touch upon an area which we never cover in professional development, and that is, how do we inspire our students? Because it's not just a transaction. I haven't just got this knowledge that I'm pouring into the head of the student. A lot of you mentioned the difficulty you have with not being able to see any novel contribution to knowledge in the dissertations that you looked at. And you can't establish that novelty, that's up to the student. But how do we inspire our students to be able to make that sort of contribution? A really interesting problem. I haven't got the answers, but I'm aware of what the significance of the question is. Okay, let's move on. If I press the right button now, is that? No? Yep. After the workshop, you'll be given the PowerPoints. So it doesn't matter if you don't capture all that's on the PowerPoints, because you'll have those to refer back to. This is just a PowerPoint, a page from the Australian Qualifications Network. In Australia, we have a system of qualifications framework, which goes from level 1, kindergarten, right up to level 10, PhD. And the government mandates that at these different levels, there are certain knowledge areas, skills, and the application of that knowledge which have to be carried out, have to be achieved in order to qualify for a master's level, an undergraduate level or a PhD level. So that's an outline here of what the knowledge and the skills and the application of those knowledge and skills are expected by the government. So every university in Australia who's offering PhD education, they'll be audited. Well, I'm not sure what it is, maybe every 5 years we get audited by a government committee, and we have to be able to demonstrate, yes, this is what we've been doing. We have met these qualifications expectations. At Victoria University, many other universities as well, we're attempting to do two things. Up the top, we've got a student coming in to a program. Here they're submitting their PhD thesis or a series of publications. In doing that, in making the journey from coming into the PhD program and completing the PhD, they need to acquire certain research skills, techniques, methodologies. But the other side of the equation is they also need to develop as an independent researcher. Think about your own students that you're supervising. Think about when they take the next step after gaining their PhD to get a promotion or to get a particular sort of job. They apply for a job Might be for a lecturer. They apply for a lecturer's job at the university. Everyone who is applying, let's say there are 50 people applying for this one position, every one of those people will already have a PhD in a relevant area. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be selected for interview. So simply having a PhD is not going to equip them to be able to say, I am the right person for this job. This is why, as well as completing a PhD, we have to ensure that we're developing all these other attributes and skills that's going to equip them for the sorts of choices they want to make once they complete their PhD. And in doing this, we use a framework from a British group called VITAE, V-I-T-A-E, and we are members of this group. And they talk in terms, and we now talk in terms of Victoria University, in terms of how we train our doctoral students, in terms of 4 domains. Domain A, knowledge and intellectual abilities. These are the sorts of abilities required to be able to complete a PhD thesis, covering the knowledge base, cognitive abilities, and creativity. There's also personal effectiveness domain, covering personal qualities, self-management, professional and career development. Are you saying I can use this as a pointer, or what do I press for that?
It's the other way around.
Oh, very good, thank you. This one at the top. This one. Oh, I've got it, okay. Domain C, research, governance and organisation, covering knowledge and skills in the area of professional conduct, research management, finance, funding and resources. Finally, engagement, influence and impact, covering working with others, communication and dissemination, and engagement and impact. Now, the importance of these, we can go out one further in the circle. Knowledge and intellectual abilities, subject knowledge, cognitive abilities, analysing, synthesising, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity. Again, the role of imagination is critically important here. When you get the PowerPoint slides, you'll be able to read this and you'll see them more clearly. Let's go one step further out. This is a framework we're using. In terms of knowledge and intellectual abilities, this research and development framework that we're using, knowledge of, typically for a PhD student, knowledge of the area of research, the advances within it, and its relationships with other research areas. Again, going back to what we heard about some of the deficiencies of the theses that you looked at, many of them were lacking a sense of the relationship between their research and other research which is being carried out, other publications. Sources of information, bibliographic software, information technologies. Again, attributes which are necessary if you're going to be operating at doctoral level. Behaviour, conducts effective and comprehensive information searches. So, again, that was a persistent sort of theme when you were talking. Some of the people had not conducted those searches right up to the present. Some of them had simply taken for granted what they read and then reproduced that themselves without thinking about, well, what am I doing which is going beyond that? Records, manages and handles information using appropriate bibliographical software and other information technologies. The person who was commenting about the poor referencing, the inconsistencies of the referencing. Now, if that person had been using a consistent bibliographical software like EndNote, for instance, that wouldn't have happened. In terms of behaviour, the cognitive abilities, thinks originally, independently, critically, develops theoretical concepts. Again, elements which were missing when you were reporting on the thesis that you read. Recognises and validates problems. Formulates and applies solutions to a range of research problems. In terms of attitude, takes a creative, imaginative and inquiring approach to research, is open to new sources of ideas. We could do the same sort of thing in terms of personal effectiveness. We won't go through it, we don't have the time, but the information is there. This group, VTI, it probably is beyond your resource base to be able to become members of it. I found out, I got an email I asked yesterday, it cost us $4,800 a year to be a member. But it gives us access to all of the development that this group of universities in the UK is grappling with. In terms of an investment, it's a great investment for us, but again, it might be beyond your resources. Now, when we look at personal effectiveness, there will be some supervisors, the first thing they'll say is, well, what's that got to do with completing a PhD? Why is being an effective person in terms of interpersonal skills, being able to get on with other people, why is that important? Why should we be worrying about that with our students? Why should we be concerned with that as a supervisor? Just consider this. Without those sorts of people skills, how to get on with people, how to approach people, how to get what you want from the way you interrelate with people. Without those sorts of skills, the students are unlikely to develop the research skills and techniques in order to complete their thesis. Look at the wide range of people they need to interact with during their thesis writing. Supervisors, librarians, laboratory staff, academic language specialists, other students, industry partners, members of the ethics committee, travel agents. They want to go to a conference. They have to work out with a travel agency what they're going to do. And if you've got a student who comes up and says, listen here, I expect you to be doing this for me, is he going to respond positively to that student? No. He's going to close the door. You'll say, when you're going to behave appropriately, then you come back and see me. So without having that range of personal skills, without having know how to deal with people, the students are being held back in their intellectual development, in their ability to complete their thesis. And when they complete their thesis, post-PhD, when they're taking the next steps in their career development, again they need to demonstrate those qualities in personal ability to interact with people, career self-management skills, professional conduct, engaging with and influencing others. Imagine if they turn up to an interview for a position and they don't engage with the members of the selection committee. They refuse to answer their questions. They behave in an arrogant sort of way. They're not going to be chosen for that job. So the simple message here is this is part of the complexity of our role as supervisors. Taking on that responsibility for the development of the researcher as well as the completion of the research. Let's go back to the student-supervisor relationship. This is a little quote from a book by Phillips and Pugh called How to Get a PhD. Now, if you go and do a library search, you'll find that there are about 15,000 books on how to get a PhD, and most of them are not worth wasting your time. This one's not a bad little book. It's actually got some good strategies in it. But I like this quote from it. The relationship between the supervisor and the student is so crucial that students cannot afford to leave it to chance. It must be managed. It's talking to the students here. And if you, the student, are to do this well, you must understand what your supervisor expects of you. Now, of course, managing the supervisor-student relationship isn't just up to the student, and it's not just up to the supervisor. Both parties have to learn to manage that relationship. The same with my wife and I. Both of us are responsible for managing our marriage relationship. My neighbours and I, both of us are responsible for resolving disputes over the fence or a tree that's hanging over the edge. It's not just up to one party, it's up to both parties. Now that's got implications for the sort of setting that we establish in terms of our interaction with our student. Now look how this room is set up. And so the way we organise space is a really nice sort of indication of the culture we want to create. The space we've got here, it's this V shape. Now, in a way, there's a bit of equality there, because it's not as if the most important people are at the front and then you've got the least important people at the back. You go into a lecture theatre. You've got the space at the front just for that one expert, the lecturer. Everyone else is way back there. They're not important. That's the message. Now imagine if we decided, okay, we're not going to keep this V shape. We're going to turn this into a circle. So we get up and we move all these desks around here and we make a circle. Then when Orsa or I sit at our desk, there's no way we can distinguish ourselves from you. So there, the spatial arrangement is more democratic. It creates a different sort of culture. Relate this back to your own office space. How is your office set up for your meetings with your student? Because I've got a lot of colleagues, and when the student goes into their office, a PhD student, the supervisor stays behind their desk, hiding behind their laptop, ready to be able to take calls on their telephone, and sits the student out here, and they've got the desk between them. Now, what sort of a culture does that signify? Is that a welcoming culture? Is that saying, well, this is a partnership that we're both going to work at? So a simple arrangement there is, you're meeting a student, you bring your chair around, you both be sitting in an equal space, maybe sitting around a table. Now, thinking about even how you organise your office, this again is part of the complexity of being a supervisor. Extend that to the form of interaction, the way you address your student. How much opportunity do you give your student to be able to initiate the discussion? Or do we? So it's not just you, it's me as well. Yep. Press the button so you...
Okay. Over recent years, I know in Sweden that the supervisor meets the students often in public spaces and not in office spaces for a number of reasons, and one of them are accusations for sexual harassments or other harassments that has come up as an issue within many of the higher education institutions, and in particular when you have asymmetric relationships. How is that in Australia?
It's not just meeting with students, it's also meeting with colleagues. Generally, our human resources department tells the males in the organisation, if you're meeting a woman, whether it's a student or a colleague in your office, keep your door open. Right, don't close your door, because if there's an accusation that you have harassed this person or made a sexual advance or whatever it might be, how do you disprove that? So meeting in a public space is one good way of guarding against that. But as well as meeting in a public space, and sometimes you can't meet in a public space, there are issues of confidentiality that you need to discuss. But then too, you can be very careful, for instance, about the distance that you maintain. Now it's a slightly different issue, it's related, but my point was, if you think about how you arrange your office, does this imply a hierarchical relationship? Or is it trying to establish a culture in which the student and the supervisor treat each other as partners? Now, I hasten to add, I'm not suggesting that we start considering ourselves friends of our students. We're not buddies. We are still the professional. We've got the expertise. Initially, we've got the expertise. There comes a point, though, when the student's knowledge is greater than ours. Or it should be. They're the ones who are doing the research. I'm not doing all that reading, I'm not carrying out the experiments, I'm not measuring the medication. They are doing that. There comes a point when the student, a PhD student, should become the world's leading expert for that particular little bit of knowledge. That's our aim. For them to know more about that little bit of knowledge territory than anyone else in the world. And as supervisors, we have to be prepared to accept this transition when it occurs. And so our role has to change. Earlier in the piece, we're providing the instruction, the guidance. You must read this, you must consider this methodology. But as the student becomes more expert in the field, our role changes to more of that of a mentor. Eventually, more of like a colleague-to-colleague relationship. Now, these are the questions I signalled before. The sorts of questions that I encourage my colleagues and I ask myself. They fall in the areas I'm going to talk about: availability, attitude and knowledge. If we ask ourselves honestly the question, do I have the necessary time to devote to my student? How would we answer that? What are my competing responsibilities? How many other students am I supervising? Am I able to provide systematic supervision over the length of candidature? What commitments do I have outside the university? Now, asking those questions honestly isn't designed to make any of us feel guilty. It's not trying to blame someone, but it's trying to take a strategic approach to, and I have to admit, I don't have the necessary time to devote to my students. So I have to think strategically about, well, how do I make the allowances to ensure that the student gets the necessary instruction, guidance that they need? In terms of attitude, what sort of answers do we give if we're honest about these sorts of questions? Do I give the student the feeling of my being committed to them? They're not just another student. How comfortable am I with them developing their thesis? Because I've got many colleagues back at Victoria University and other Australian universities, all they really want from their students is to reproduce themselves. They want validation for their particular understanding, their particular approach. And that will not result in a novel and major contribution to knowledge. Do I provide them with support and encouragement? Now, I have to keep asking myself these questions even after 40 years as an academic, because I can easily slip away from ensuring that I'm putting the student at the centre of what I'm doing as an academic. In terms of knowledge, what is my expertise in their particular area of research? I'm sure it's the same with some of the people in this room. I've been required to supervise many students and I'm not really an expert in that area. Now, if I were to pretend that I am an expert, that's going to be misleading the student. The student has not got a hope of advancing. But if I'm honest and saying, well, that's a really interesting problem you raise there, I myself don't have the necessary knowledge to be able to answer it, but let's together try and see if we can find something in the literature. Or let me speak to my colleague who's more familiar with that particular theory. Otherwise, the student will not be able to advance and make that significant contribution to knowledge. How familiar am I with the conventions of the discipline? And I have many students in the coursework I provide who come to me and they complain. My supervisor doesn't really understand what the conventions of the discipline are. My response to them is, well, you tell me what you've done about this. You tell me what journals you've been reading to understand what the conventions are in terms of what applies. Because if you're just waiting for your supervisor to tell you, what do you expect? You have to take responsibility for your own research training. How expert or familiar am I in the appropriate methods and theories? And if we know, and if I'm honest, I'll say, yep, I'm not really expert in some of the theories and methods that I've got students working in. But if I accept that that's a starting point, at least I can then think strategically about how do I ensure that they do have that knowledge. Talking to colleagues, helping them do a literature search. Will I seek outside help if necessary? And this is a major obstacle for many academics. We're a weird breed, academics. We've been trained to sort of almost be invincible, not to admit that there are things that we don't know. I look back on my own early career 30 years ago, and a student will come into my office and they'd say, or at a lecture, they might ask a question at the end of a lecture I've given. Or how does this relate to so-and-so? And I haven't got the faintest idea. But would I have said 30 years ago, oh, I don't know that? No, what I would have said, well, that's a really interesting question, and you know I was going to deal with that next week, so we'll just have to wait until next week. So it's pretending that I know when I don't know. How confident or competent am I with supervising the craft of writing? And there are many academics who are not gifted writers. That's not their strength. There are many of the top scientists who are published in journals like Nature who really can't write at all. The fact that they're being published in Nature is because the editor realises this is making a really important contribution to knowledge and I'm going to have to rewrite it. So not being expert ourselves in writing is not an admission of failure. It's just saying I have not developed that particular range of competencies, of skills. But it means, if we're going to think strategically, if I really can't give the student the necessary advice on how to structure their writing, I need to have other strategies in place. I need to make sure that my student has got a circle of readers that they share their work with. So they're getting feedback from others. Not only other academics, but we'll talk about this in a later session, also their peers, encouraging students to read each other's work and to give feedback, which not only gives the person who's done the writing the added advantage of somebody else's understanding of what they've written, but when you're required to give that feedback yourself, you discover all sorts of strategies you can use as a writer. As I say, we'll talk about that in a later session. I'd point out these questions that I expect supervisors to ask of themselves, I also expect the students to ask of themselves. Yes, I think the students have got certain rights, but they've also got equally certain responsibilities. They have to ask those same sorts of questions about their availability, about their attitude, about their knowledge base, and not simply expect that they're going to be spoon-fed by the supervisor. That book, Phillips and Pugh, How to Get a PhD, that I referred to before, they conducted a whole series of interviews with students in the UK. And these were the expectations that they picked up from the students that they talked with. Students expect to be supervised. Having a supervisor is not the same thing as being supervised. Students expect supervisors to read their work well in advance. Supervisors expect supervisors to be available when needed. Of course, that needs to be negotiated. Students expect supervisors to be friendly, open and supportive. Notice, friendly, not necessarily a friend, but to be friendly. Students expect supervisors to be constructively critical. None of us wants feedback where we just get a sort of a pat on the head and say, oh, that's really good. That doesn't help us. Neither do we want feedback which you say, that's really obvious and stupid. What's wrong with you? That's not helpful either. We want constructive critical feedback. And that's a particular sort of skill that we need to develop as supervisors. Students expect supervisors to have a good knowledge of the research area. Students expect supervisors to structure the tutorial, the meeting, so that it's easy to exchange ideas. That supervisors will have sufficient interest in their research to put more information to them. And students expect their supervisors to be sufficiently involved in their success to help them get a good job at the end of it all. I have to admit, I draw the line there. My life is so busy and complicated, I have to admit I don't take much of an interest in the career prospects of the students once I've finished supervising them.
So the supervisor should be able as agile.
Agile, yeah, absolutely. Agile, but also accepting there are limits to what we can be expected to do. when I have workshops with students, this is what I tell them. This is what their supervisors expect. And I have to say to you, a lot of supervisors don't have these expectations, but this is what they should expect. That the student will become increasingly independent and not depend upon us for everything. That they will regularly produce written work. Well, there are some supervisors who don't want to see any written work until 2 years. My rule with my students is if they don't give me something in writing before each meeting, and we have to meet with them once a fortnight, 3 working days before I meet, call off the meeting. I'm not going to meet with you. Right? There has to be something in writing. Early in candidature, it might be 1 page. Later, it might be a review of a journal article. Later, it might be their understanding of a particular theory. Eventually, it'll be whole chapters. Now, what that enables me to do is I can see from the very beginning of my work with the student if they've got writing problems. Because I want to be able to start fixing those problems from the beginning, not after 2 years. We expect to meet with our students regularly. In Australia, we have to meet with them on average once a fortnight. That's a rule. Once a fortnight, for at least an hour. We expect them to be honest with us. Now, that requires us to develop the sort of culture with the student where they are confident to be honest.
But it's needed regularly. How many times that students should?
How many times they should? On average, once a fortnight, at least once a fortnight for 1 hour. Fortnightly, every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks for 1 hour. Now, that comment there, that I certainly expect my students to be honest with me, being honest means something like this. Okay, I'll use you, if I can now, for a little role play. You and I will do a little role play, okay? What you just did then, you nodded, you just keep nodding. That's all you have to do. You're my student, you just keep nodding, because this is what we do when we meet someone. This is what students do with us, they'll just nod. Okay, you've just given me chapter 3, which I've read, okay, and you've now come to see me about chapter 3. Just keep nodding. I want the nods, yep. Henny, I'm really impressed with chapter 3. Keep nodding, don't look surprised. Yep. I think it really is beginning to make a major contribution to our understanding of this issue. I think it's beginning to show that we can, this will be a social science area, it's beginning to show that we can understand the way power operates in South Sulawesi in a different sort of way, okay? But I think it will benefit from introducing Foucault into the discussion. Keep nodding. And because that way you're going to provide us with a theoretical understanding which is not in the literature. Henny goes away, and the feedback I've got is yes, she understands what I'm saying. When I said to her, I think you should introduce Foucault into the discussion, she leaves her meeting and she thinks, Foucault, what's that? Never heard of Foucault. But what I got as her supervisor when she was nodding was, yep, I fully understand you, I'm going to go and do that. So she goes and she does a Google search. Foucault, never heard of him. Foucault, by the way, you spell F-O-U-C-A-U-L-T. But she's never heard of him. She spells it P-H-O-O, Foucault, C-O. She goes and looks up in the library, Foucault, no reference. She does a Google search, Foucault, P-H-O-O-Co. She comes up, there's a tea exporting company in Hong Kong called the Foo Company. Now she's doing her thesis on power relationships in South Sulawesi, and she thinks to herself, I don't see what tea exports has got to do with this, but he's the professor, he knows. So she spends 2 weeks investigating tea exports in Hong Kong. Comes back in a fortnight, I ask her, Henny, how did it go with my suggestion about introducing Foucault into your analysis? And she says, well, I approached it really seriously and I did a search on Foucault and I've got all the tea exporting data and I'll stop it. What do you mean you've got all this tea exporting data? Well, you told me to go and introduce Foucault, and the only Foucault, that's when the penny drops for me. Oh, sorry, I should have made sure that you understood what I was asking 2 weeks ago. I met Michel Foucault, who's written all these books. Really difficult person to understand, so why don't you read this introductory text? Then I can be a proper supervisor. And I can be a proper supervisor because she's been honest with me in terms of not misleading me, that she understands exactly what I'm asking. But that's only going to happen if she and I have got the sort of relationship where she feels confident enough to say, oh, hold on, Ron, or hold on, Professor. I think I'm meant to know this, but I'm sorry, I've never heard of, what is it, Foucault? What do you mean by that? That then enables me to tell her. Now, what we can do as supervisors, we can keep checking ourselves when we're meeting with our students. Oh, you looked a little bit puzzled when I said Foucault. Henny, do you understand what I mean? I'm giving her the invitation to then say, no, I don't. Can you please elaborate? A very small shift, but it can be very, very significant in terms of the supervising role that we're playing. Okay. Can I do that, have them fill out, have we got time to have them fill out that, or you would like me to do it later? Yeah.
Yeah, I think Professor Adams has already provided us with the very comprehensive complexities of doctoral supervision, but I would like to add something that might be important within the Indonesian context. Actually, we are expecting our students to become a full-time students, but in reality, they are not, because they are not staying in Jogja, and they keep doing work that is their routine work before they were admitted to the PhD students, because unlike in the developed country settings, where probably most of your students are fresh graduates from undergraduate, but with us, most of our students are mid-career person who already assume some position in their job. So there is a conflict of duties within the program, and one of the advice that that is my favorite to give to them early at the beginning of the process is that they should not look for time to do the PhD, but they should make time to do the PhD. But most of the time it will be difficult. So
I think that's a really valuable insight. It's not just a matter of having the time, but having them make the time. And that entails, I think, lots of discussions between early discussions between the supervisor and the student, helping them with some strategies for making time. One of the things I do with some of my students who have that difficulty is I sit down with them and I'll just spend half an hour having them tell me everything you've done in the last week. And I'll draw a very complicated timetable, and then together we'll look for where are those areas where you could be devoting more time, making time for your PhD. But thank you very much for providing that Indonesian context. What I'm going to do, I'm going to distribute you something now. We're going to break for morning tea now, but I'm going to distribute you a survey, a questionnaire, which I'd like you to complete during morning tea time. It'll only take you 2 minutes. And there are a series of questions on here, and you have to circle them from 1 to 5, depending upon whether or not you agree with the proposition. Don't share it with others. This has to be, because we're going to compare the results afterwards. So during morning tea, I'll hand this out now. Hide yourself away from the others and just spend 1 or 2 minutes completing this, and then we'll compare the results when we come back. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we'll have a 20-minute break, and during that break, please just have a couple of minutes to go through this.